Okay.
Hello, my name is Ahad. I'm going to be talking about the descending loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting ducts. So let's start with the descending loop of Henle. The most important thing you have to remember is that it's made of three parts: a thin ascending, a thick ascending, and thin descending limb. Another thing that they'd really like to ask, which is a tie-in to histology, is they'll ask you what this is lined with. So the thin ascending and thin descending limbs are lined with squamous epithelium cells. The lumen and the basolateral faces the interstitium. And the thick ascending is lined with cuboidal epithelium. So that's a question they really like to ask in the BCQ. Another thing they really like to ask is all the nephron is surrounded by a peritubular capillary, but the one specific to the loop of Henle is called the vasa recta. So you should really remember that because they really like to ask that question. Another thing they like to ask is that they'll ask you the length of the loop of Henle, and for animals that live in deserts like camels and these sorts, their loop of Henle is always longer because the loop of Henle is responsible for urine concentration and those animals have less access to water. Yes, as I was saying, you have to remember the epithelium cells. Another thing that's very important in regards to the limbs is their water permeability. So the descending limbs is always water permeable. So you can imagine like a water slide or any way you want to remember it. But and then an ascending limb is always impermeable to water. And there are two ascending limbs, a thin ascending limb and a thick ascending limb. So it's thick, so you would assume cuboidal epithelium, and it has these very important co-transporters, NAK2Cl minus transporters. This is important because it ties in with pharmacology and loop diuretics that inhibit this transporter. Yes, this is countercurrent multiplication. You must have seen it in your slides. It looks intermittent, but honestly, they don't ask much about it. The main thing you have to remember again is that the descending limb is permeable to water and the ascending limb is impermeable to water. And the essential function of countercurrent multiplication is to create an osmotic gradient, which creates a more concentrated urine. So it's not too high yield, but just remember the permeabilities and then it creates an osmotic gradient to concentrate urine. Yeah, so now we've come to the distal convoluted tubule. So the early distal, it's divided into two, the early and the late distal convoluted tubule. The early distal convoluted is also impermeable to water, and it's very important for the fine tuning of sodium ion concentration. And it has another very high yield transporter, the Na plus Cl minus transporter, which is inhibited by thiazide diuretic. This is also a question they like to ask. Otherwise, it's just responsible for fine tuning of sodium ion concentration. This is the late distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct can be discussed as one because physiologically they're quite similar. They have two main types of cells, are the principal cells and the alpha intercalated cells. So you have to remember the principal cells are mostly responsible for sodium reabsorption and potassium, but the alpha intercalated cells are more responsible for H plus ions and potassium ions. And you have to remember the ENAC channel and this ties in a lot with pharmacology with K plus prime diuretics and aldosterone mimetics, but that's a different topic. Yeah, so this is an example of an alpha intercalated cell. As you see, it's mostly responsible for the balance of H plus ions in the body. So as you can see, there's the carbonic anhydrase, and this is the whole function of how it works. It's not too high yield, but and Mustaq explained it to you as well in PCTs. It's about the same action, but just remember the alpha intercalated cells are for H plus ions, and principal cells are for sodium and potassium. This also does potassium, but the one differentiating factor is the H plus ion. Yeah, so another important thing is the hormones that act on the kidney. Because they always really like to ask this question. So the first one, you probably remember this even from O levels is and A levels is ADH. So ADH acts on the collecting duct and the distal and the late distal convoluted tubule, and it acts on uh, aquaporin 2 channels. So they always ask which they'll give you the example of ADH, somebody's thirsty, which channel does it act on? So the answer is always aquaporin 2. So essentially, whenever you're thirsty or low on water, ADH is released by your body and it will increase the permeability so you reabsorb more. And obviously you can't, now you have to get more specific about it. So you have to mention the channel is aquaporin 2. PTH, as Musaq mentioned, also acts on the proximal convoluted tubule for phosphate reabsorption. So essentially what it does is it increases the reabsorption of calcium and decreases the reabsorption of phosphate. So that's very important. It ties in with endo as well. So aldosterone it's part of the RAS system. And what aldosterone essentially does, you have to remember this, is it increases the secretion of potassium and H plus ions and increases the reabsorption of sodium ion. So it's very important. Sometimes they ask you its exact function or if inhibited with some drugs. You have to remember it reabsorbs sodium and it secretes potassium and H plus ions. ANP is secreted by it's an atrial natriuretic peptide. So what happens, natriuresis means to remove sodium ion. So if there's increased blood pressure, the atria will stretch more, and then that causes an increase in pressure. So what the body does, it releases ANP. So ANP increases your GFR and decreases sodium reabsorption to kind of reduce your blood pressure. Angiotensin 2 is again part of your RAS system. So angiotensin 2 is released to decrease your blood pressure and to decrease blood volume. It binds with 81 and 82 receptors. It increases your Na plus H plus ion exchange and bicarbonate ion reabsorption, and it decreases GFR through its vascular effect. So its main function is to decrease your blood pressure and blood volume. Yeah, so this is just a summary of everything we said today. So we'll share this slide with you and we can share this picture with you. So, Mustaq, is there anything you'd like to add?
So pretty much for med school exams, you should know the higher stuff that we discussed over here. Some other things that I like to add that they can probably ask you guys is, for example, they can ask you which part of the nephron contains the brush border. So you should know that it's the proximal convoluted tubule. The PCT is the only part of the nephron that contains the brush border. Other things which you should know is that the hormonal actions on the kidney, how the various hormones that Ahad discussed, how they act on the kidney and what effects do they cause. So I remember in our exams, they asked us that what's the effect of parathyroid hormone? What does parathyroid hormone cause increased reabsorption of which ion? So you should know that that's calcium ions. All right, parathyroid hormone is going to cause increased reabsorption of calcium, but in exchange, it's going to cause increased excretion of phosphate ions. They can also ask you about like buffers, so intracellular buffers, extracellular buffers, and you should know that that the protein buffer system is the intracellular buffer that has a pK value closest to the body's pH. So the protein buffer system is important to know. They can other question that they can probably ask you is about the filtration barrier in the Bowman's capsule. Like, what's the most important part of the Bowman's capsule, the major functional barrier? So you should know that it's the capillary endothelium. That's the most important. That's the most important functional barrier within the Bowman's capsule. And another thing that I discussed about the proximal convoluted tubule, they can ask you with respect to plasma. What's the osmolarity of the filtrate within the PCTs? So I mentioned that it's isoosmolar. So that's very important to know. So other than that, I think we discussed pretty much the higher stuff of tubular reabsorption and secretion. And if you guys have any problem, anything you want to ask, feel free to message us at Tutor and Guidance, and we'll be happy to help. We can also share the slides with you if you want this. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.